Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Malkin Fund, May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America. I'm Richard Heffner, your host on The Open Mind, and several times over the past few years, my guest today, social psychologist Eric Wanner, the learned president of the Russell Sage Foundation for 2 decades now, has joined me here to talk about one aspect or another of inequality in America, which somehow, nevertheless, seems implacably to march on, meaning perhaps that our palavering just hasn't been all that effective. What has been effective, however, has been the now century-long joining of the spoils of Robber Baron Russell Sage's 19th century financial wizardry and the philanthropic instincts and wisdom of his generous widow, Olivia Sage. For it was she who, just 100 years ago, took millions her buccaneering late husband had willed to her and endowed the foundation that ironically bears her husband's name, but worked so hard to conduct research to help us understand and then perhaps to remedy the harsher heritage of the Gilded Age in which Russell Sage functioned so brilliantly, but that indeed may be trumped in our own times. Funded by Olivia Sage in 1907 for, quote, the improvement of social and living conditions in the United States, end quote, the Russell Sage Foundation now dedicates itself to, quote again, strengthening the methods, data, and theoretical core of the social sciences, end quote. But to what end? That remains the principal question, one raised by historian Alice O'Connor in Social Science for What?, one of 3 foundation studies that marks the Russell Sage centenary. Best, of course, that I put that question to Dr. Wanner himself.
Well, thank you for having me back. Social science for what, indeed? Social science has always claimed to be able to provide a different kind of social knowledge, a more systematic, reliable kind of social knowledge, which gets at underlying causes, things that you can't see necessarily on the surface, but are nevertheless going on underneath what you can see. I have a friend, Sandy Jenks, who talks about social science as slow journalism, but he's
slow journalism,
but he's not being entirely fair, and he knows it. There's an effort to do more than journalists telling stories, but taking more time to do it. There's an effort to get in underneath and understand what's driving the stories that you can see on the surface.
To what end?
To what end? So now we have to talk about democracy a little bit and what you think, how you think democratic decisions ought to be informed. I think the basic idea of the progressives was that we need better institutions, and to have better institutions we need to know more about how social life works, put simply, and people need generally to have that systematic social knowledge. So the end would be a more informed democracy capable of choosing institutions which were more beneficial broadly to the body politic and to the functioning of the society.
Eric, seriously, why do you use the phrase, or what do you mean by better institutions? And would you and I necessarily agree on them? Or more importantly, would you and I and those who reject the progressive tradition agree on them? And there are many of those people around today.
Absolutely. And certainly better implies a judgment. and judgments are often based on values, and we may disagree in our values. What social science can let you do, however, is understand what the consequences of your value choices might be. So social science can at least say, if you choose thus and such an institution, here is what will happen, or here's what has happened. So then you can see what the implications of your values are, and maybe that promotes change.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Do you think that's been true in terms of the 100 years of the Russell Sage Foundation?
I think it has been true in some respects. Certainly the progressives had a lot of early successes in terms of changing institutions governing child labor, governing working hours, governing city managers and the way cities were governed, health and safety laws and so forth. There was in the high progressive period from about 1910 to 1915, there was an enormous outburst of reform based, as Alice O'Connor says, on the kinds of systematic social knowledge that social scientists were beginning to produce, albeit in much more flawed and less sophisticated ways than we can do now.
She's not a very happy lady right now, is she?
No, she's not a very happy lady, because society is being organized and driven more and more by values that she disagrees with. And her argument is that social scientists should be more overt about the values that they believe in, so that they can fully do battle, fully armed with their ideological opponents.
Well, she makes the point, and it certainly doesn't, there seems to be every reason to believe that the name she mentions, the institution she quotes, are very real, and that is that there has been a counter social science revolution of a kind. Or would you say that the rise of conservative, non-progressive think tanks, foundations, and the rest are more anti-intellectual, rather than that they are based also upon research, but research with different values in mind?
I don't see them as anti-intellectual, and I do believe that there's a research component. I think to the right-wing, what should we call it, reaction to the liberal ascendancy between whatever 1930 and 1980. We can, of course, quarrel about their empiricism just as they can quarrel about the empiricism of liberals, but I think it's benighted to deny to them the same kind of epistemological stance that we have. So they have strong convictions about the benefits of markets. They have strong convictions about the benefits of individual responsibility. They have strong convictions generally about non-interference with economic affairs, keeping the government out of the economy and so forth. Those are their values. I think the most that social science can do is work out some of the implications of those values. So the return of inequality, which is quite unprecedented, really, as far as we know in history, the general tendency for mature economies was for inequality to decline. And as we've talked about before, beginning in the late 70s, inequality, which had been declining since World War II, turned around and started to rise, and it's continued to rise. So what social science has tried to do, or what the social science that we've supported has tried to do, is to say, describe systematically, here's what's happened, and the best we can tell you about why it's happened. So some of the implications of reducing economic regulation, of producing a more unfettered variety of capitalism, has been a return of inequality.
You're very generous in accepting the notion that you can give the title social science research both to the right and to the progressive groups that the Russell Sage Foundation epitomized.
Sure.
And you do feel that way? That yes. Both represent or both foster social science research?
Yes, an example would be the infamous bell curve, I guess, infamous from the point of view of the left at any rate, which tried to argue that meritocracy, the open economy that we are increasingly embracing, would lead to a hereditary meritocracy because of a high hereditary component for IQ. And that IQ, the economic returns to IQ were increasing. One generation passed on its IQ to the next generation via the genes, and that would lead inexorably to an ascendant class and a subordinate class.
You reject that?
Well, it's very interesting, not just that I reject it, but how it's rejected. So that led to a long and very vigorous social scientific debate about the interpretation of data, about just exactly how heritable IQ is, what the environmental influences on IQ are, how appropriate IQ tests are to move from one cultural context to another cultural context. Are you still tapping something which, some kind of ability which is expressible in other circumstances? Do people who suffer some kind of environmental disadvantage also show up as disadvantaged on the test? So it led to a large scientific debate, not necessarily a values debate, but a scientific debate about whether this was the right way to understand the transmission of advantage.
Do you think, Eric, that the knowledge, that the research of one side, if I may put it that way, rather than the other, can be accepted when we're really talking about values, as you suggest? I mean, what does the research mean?
Well, certainly the research will always be contested, and it may well be contested because people don't want to believe it, given their pre-scientific values. So, for example, we'll get a test of this now because, as you know, if you read the paper this week, or was it last week, abstinence-only sex education was shown not to be effective. And this was a very high-quality study. And there's every reason to believe this results, as far as I can see, although I haven't stared at it closely. This may or may not be accepted by people who find other kinds of sex education morally unacceptable. So notice what happened was the science came in to say, given that you can have different kinds of education about sexual reproduction, what are the consequences in terms of the behavior of the students who are exposed to those different curricula? That's what social science does for you. Then the question is, what do your values tell you by way of continuing, let's say, a curriculum that has been shown to be ineffective in terms of its consequences? You may still say, I want to do it, that's what I want to teach. I don't want to teach other methods I don't want to teach any other methods of restricting reproduction. But that's a moral decision, and it flies in the face of now what looks like a scientific evidence that doesn't work.
I was fascinated when I was there at your 100th birthday.
Yeah.
That when there were comments about Russell Sage, the robber baron, there was a lot of snickering, good-natured snickering about the fact that the irony of this man's fortune being placed in part at the service of the progressive movement, really. What is your own posture on the question of the uses of funds that come from the counterpart of robber barons or the robber barons themselves? The appropriateness. I mean, the Russell Sage Foundation has been very fortunate.
Yes, I guess we haven't crossed that moral bridge because of the intermediation of our founder, Margaret Olivia Sage, and as you described the story so nicely in the introduction, she inherited his $75 million, which in modern terms would be about $1.5 billion, I guess, and gave it all the way in the last 10 years of her life, about a third of it to start our foundation. We've always considered her our benefactress, and yes, the money came from this period of American capitalism which was highly unregulated, in which there was this enormous expansion of the Continental Railroad system, in which there were enormous profits to be made from connecting up the network internalities, network profits, and he captured a lot of those. He also did some things that would be illegal today, but weren't then.
Don't smile so broadly.
I said at our dinner that we're the beneficiaries of a great historical accident, namely the convergence of his financial wiles her evangelical commitment to social betterment and the progressives' belief in social science. I don't really think I've worried about the morality of accepting that money. It seemed to me the thing to do was to do good social science, and I believe, as the progressives did, that good will come of it.